From the battlefield to the negotiating table, the crisis between Washington and Tehran is entering a critical new phase. After months of military escalation, naval blockades, and economic pressure, a fragile ceasefire mediated by Pakistan may soon evolve into a formal agreement. While US President Donald Trump confidently declares that a 60-day extension deal is practically signed and the Strait of Hormuz will reopen immediately, Tehran remains highly cautious. Iranian officials are pushing back against artificial deadlines, demanding ironclad guarantees regarding sanctions relief, the unfreezing of assets, and an end to US naval blockades. Are we witnessing the end of one of the Middle East's most dangerous and economically devastating wars? Or is this merely a tactical pause before the next storm? We'll look at the divergent narratives, the shift in geopolitical alliances, and the massive global stakes with our panel of experts shortly on All 24 News Special. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to All 24 News special coverage with me, Karim Fazakari. And before we bring in our guest and start the discussion, here's a report and then we come back.
Is the Middle East on the verge of a historic peace agreement, or are we witnessing yet another round of diplomatic bluff? Across the Middle East and beyond, the atmosphere is charged with both anticipation and skepticism. US President Donald Trump and mediator Pakistan announced on Saturday that the deal between Tehran and Washington would be signed on Sunday. Iran, however, refrained from confirming a specific timeline. Under the proposed Memorandum of Understanding, Iran would immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping, while the United States would begin lifting its naval blockade of the Iranian ports. As for the thorniest issues, including Iran's nuclear program, frozen assets and sanctions relief, will be left to a 60-day round of technical talks. One of Iran's main conditions for an agreement is stopping the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, which has come under Zionist aggression since the beginning of March. Yet, right after the deal was announced, the Zionist forces attacked Beirut's southern suburbs, triggering a furious reaction from Tehran, which wanted a strong response and declared that fingers are on the trigger. In a Sunday interview with Axios, Trump, on the other hand, maintained that the signing was still on track, but would be delayed by, quote, a few hours due to the Zionist strikes. Against this backdrop and behind closed doors, diplomats are racing to finalize the documents, with Qatari mediators reportedly traveling to Tehran on Sunday, but the situation on the ground remains volatile and the finish line has not yet been crossed.
To unpack the complexities of this fragile ceasefire, the hypocrisy dominating the international stage, and the profound impact on the global south, I am joined by a distinguished panel of experts. First, Ms. Zahra Ladha, Middle East analyst and political risk specialist. She joins us from Istanbul this time. Good to see you, Zahra.
Likewise. Thank you for having me back.
And we're also a pleasure to have Dr. Khaled Al-Kassimi, Associate Professor of International Relations and Political Philosophy. He joins us from Ontario, Canada. Hello there, Professor. Nice to see you with us again.
Pleasure to have you and your respected guests.
Thank you. And we also have Dr. Khodr Zaarour Mina, U.S. Foreign Policy, Strategy and International Security expert at North Carolina State University. He joins us from Raleigh. Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invite.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by Professor Tahir Naeem Malik, political analyst and academician, joining us from Islamabad, Pakistan. A pleasure to have you with us in the show, Professor.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, let's start the debate with you, Ms. Zahra. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, is trying to rush to claim a diplomatic victory, declaring the deal effectively signed and the Strait of Hormuz open. Tehran, however, on the other hand, is pushing back against these unilateral announcements. So my question goes like this: is Washington's haste driven by a genuine desire for peace, or is it desperate, or perhaps a desperate domestic political maneuver to salvage an unpopular war that has severely alienated European allies and the global South for that matter?
Yes, I mean, it's fair to say now that the US president has concluded that further economic and military pressure on Iran is unlikely to yield the concessions that he was seeking from this war. I mean, in the last 100 days, we've seen the US employ a range of measures, including naval blockades on Iran's oil exports, military strikes, threats against Iran's energy infrastructure. And despite all of this, Iran has not made any concessions on its regional posture, its ballistic missile program, and crucially, these nuclear negotiations. And this all comes as the economic cost for both Tehran and Washington is mounting. So the question now isn't if both sides want de-escalation, they appear to. The question is, what does the mechanism to de-escalation actually look like? And I think this is where we're seeing some of the mixed messaging coming out of Tehran and Washington, because the points of divergence are really about what this framework looks like, whether or not and how Lebanon will be included in a ceasefire, what frozen assets will be released, what kind of sanction relief the Islamic Republic can expect, what kind of constraints there'll be on the nuclear program, and of course, how and when the Strait of Hormuz reopens. So we're not really seeing a push for escalation from either of the main stakeholders, the US and Iran, but really disagreements over what the pathway to peace looks like.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at the points perhaps that are drawing these disagreements with you, Dr. Khaled Al-Kassimi. If we look at the proposed terms, which demand the dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure while maintaining a heavy US naval presence, many in the global South see a blatant double standard here. How does this agreement reflect the hypocrisy of Western hegemony, where international law is seemingly weaponized to disarm adversaries while entirely ignoring the aggressive actions of US allies in the Middle East, like Israel?
Once again, it's a pleasure to be back. The double standard is evident, but I do think it is misleading to cast Iran solely as a victim of US or Israeli hypocrisy. The IRGC has been a central driver of regional instability. I'm sure we all remember that the IRGC has cultivated militias across the Arab region and North Africa, whether that is in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, at some point in Egypt, and that has undermined sovereignty and has inflamed sectarianism. So this has made the IRGC a structurally useful antagonist for Washington. Its actions actually help justify the United States deployment, arms sales, and maritime policing. I do want to mention that there are Iranian moderates in Iran, such as Hassan Rouhani, Jawad Zarif, Khatami, Hamati, who have constantly warned that the IRGC adventurism, if you will, in the past 20 years has weakened Iran diplomatically and deepened its isolation. So if you want these individuals, these politicians, rather than ideologues, they represent an Iran oriented toward regional integration and stability. However, and I will be getting to your question more specifically, but I do think that the context is important for our viewers, because I don't want to just repeat media narratives, right? So I just want to highlight that the IRGC advances a militarized ideology that thrives on confrontation and consolidates domestic power through external conflict. So against this backdrop, if we were to go back to your initial question, the proposed agreement, if you reject or refuse to consider anything that I just said previously, then yes, the agreement does seem like selective legality. We all know that Israel is not a party of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it faces no comparable pressure, right? It bombs wherever it wills, and here we have Iran, who is a member. It's subjected to sanctions, strikes, and persistent surveillance. That asymmetry is real, 100%. However, for every cause, there's an effect. And IRGC activities, whether proxy warfare, attacks on shipping, and violations of regional sovereignty, specifically of GCC powers, Jordan, at some point Turkey or Turkey, they've actually weakened Iran's legal position, and they've enabled Western states to frame it as like a special case, right? So both sides legally rely on contested justifications, right? Obviously, the United States continuously violates international humanitarian law. So does Israel, but so does the IRGC. And they each have their own discourse. The United States uses this idea of anticipatory self-defense, which is like a very fancy legal term. But again, Iran's use of militias, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hezbollah in Iraq or the popular mobilization units, they also disregard civilian protection in regional theaters of conflict. And this is obviously very clear in what's been happening in the GCC as well. So in closing, I would say that, yes, the US naval presence in the Gulf is obviously framed as safeguarding freedom of navigation, which reflects a structural imbalance because you're weaponizing and militarizing an international waterway, which obviously violates international law, but is more specifically the United Nations Convention, the UN clause. Yet also the IRGC saying that it wants to instill a toll in the Hormuz also violates international law. So the result is not unilateral hypocrisy, but a mutually reinforcing dynamic. And I totally agree with your previous, the previous guest, my apologies, I forgot your name, from Turkey, that, you know, now we have this idea of like signing an MOU and everyone is wondering, is it going to be digital or not? But you're just buying time to IRGC, Tel Aviv, and powers that want to further prolong this war. So
here. Thank you, Dr. Al-Kassimi. And now let me bring Dr. Khodr Zaarour. Dr. Khodr Zaarour, meanwhile, we can still that the opposition within the American political and military establishment itself is growing by the minute. Many analysts argue that the U.S. severely miscalculated its strategy, waging a costly and unwinnable war that served Israel's strategic interests far more than America's own. So has the Washington establishment finally realized the limits of its hard power in the Middle East?
Good evening again, and hello to all your guests, and thanks for having me. Oh, well, anytime there is a conflict, military conflict in any country, especially in the US, post-Korea and Vietnam, division will emerge, when the conflict drags on. In this case, several months, 47 years of sanctions and counter-sanctions and military adventurism. Certainly, during time of war, that gap widens a little bit. So there's a big divide between the State Department and the military establishment. Even within the military establishment, there are two different views. One is America first, and second is, well, in this case, our allies, Israel, in this case, first. Well, the American public is waking up to, really, it's a rude awakening, simply put by saying, as the war dragged on, we have seen more American people moving toward the left side of politics, the right side of politics, the Republicans, MAGA folks, who thought maybe a military adventure for a few days in Iran will bring victory. And as we have seen, President Trump is really searching for a quick victory than quick peace. We may find and sign an agreement, even electronic signature. This may or may not happen, but it's a shaky peace, simply because people on the right side of politics in America, they do want to see a clear military victory, like maybe May 8, 1945 with Germany, or maybe, or August 8, 1945 with Japan. That's not going to happen with Iran. I think the president and folks on the right with a mega believed that it was easy to take out Maduro in Venezuela. And I thought the likelihood taking out the Iranian regime with the support of the Iranians and diaspora, especially in the sea area, that will bring in a new regime friendly to the U.S. and its allies in the region. In fact, the son of the Shah, when he was invited to the White House to speak to Mr. Trump, the first thing he said, I will do as a new president of Iran, I will make peace with Israel. That's not what the Iranian people want to see. And that's not what the American people want to hear. Simply, they want to see an end to the sanctions, end to the war, end to conflict. Because let's to be honest, on your show, neither side, the U.S. or Iran, have been a stabilizing force in the Middle East. In fact, there have been destabilizing forces in the Middle East. We have seen the U.S. going into Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria. I could name countries all day long. And of course, Iran has been totally destructive in Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, especially Iraq, and Afghanistan. They play that balancing power, and sometimes they play the victim. They may have some legitimacy, but their credibility, along with the U.S. credibility in the Middle East, is not only shaking, it's probably dying.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khodr. Now, let me bring Professor Tahir, Naeem, Malik. Professor Malik, Pakistan has emerged among this as the indispensable mediator, stepping in to secure a ceasefire extension where Western diplomacy completely failed. How did Islamabad manage to maintain credibility with both Washington and Tehran? And does this signal a new era where the global South actively shapes regional security architectures rather than relying on Western dictates?
I think there are three main reasons or factors behind Pakistan's occupying the strategic space in Middle East. We have seen this in a last couple of years, Pakistan emerging as a fair arbitrator between Iran and America or Saudi Arabia. If you are look at the geopolitics of Middle East, there are three powers who are competing to gain the position of regional dominance in Middle East. One is Iran, the other is Saudi Arabia, the third is Turkey. So they are party and they are competing with each other. But Pakistan's foreign policy has been the cornerstone of its foreign policy is not to get involved in competition or rivalry between two Muslim states. So with Saudi Arabia, it has brotherly relationship. Recently, we have seen that they have signed a defense pact between the two states. And with Iran, they share it's a neighbor of Pakistan. And during the Iraq-Iran war in 1980s, Pakistan not only remained neutral, but it tried fairly to arbitrate between the two states. So this is one thing. And second, it's in the apart from regional context, we have seen in the international politics, there is multipolarity, there are multiple poles of power. So on the one hand, Pakistan is a medium-sized country, nuclear-capable state, and with a strong military. But it has history of Western alliance starting from Cold War and the second phase of Cold War and post-Cold War against terror. It was the non-aligned, most trusted non-aligned ally of United States during war against terror in Afghanistan. At the other aspect of Pakistan's foreign policy, it is trusted and deep-rooted relationship with China that exceeds beyond foreign policy. There is a defense component, there is geoeconomics like China-Pakistan economic corridor. So behind the scene, I think China was fully on board, and with the US President Donald Trump, they had a very good equation and balance. So Pakistan used this platform and position from arbitrator from facilitator to mediator. This was Pakistan's rise. First, they assumed the role of facilitator Islamabad is the place, it's capital of Pakistan, where the Islamabad talks happened. And there were behind the scene, there was a lot of interactions with the Iranian, with the Saudi Arabians, with the Chinese. So Pakistan's military chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, its foreign minister, interior minister, and the government, they have multiple interactions with on the one hand with America, and on the other hand with Saudi Arabia and Iran. And in the near future, if there is such deal, we are coming to close this deal. Pakistan has a great role, and this was also Pakistan's core interest. Why? Because if you look at the perspective of Pakistan, Pakistan has witnessed and it has suffered impact of Afghan war, the great game in Afghanistan, Cold War in Afghanistan, last 30, 40 years. We have seen and witnessed and suffered the economic fallout of the war and the security dimension and the foreign policy impacts and the extremism, terrorism within the country. So Pakistan is very much cautious that there should be no war there should be peace, there should be normalization between Iran and America. The last dimension in this regard is the nexus, the shifting regional politics with the UAE, India, and Israel. They have created a sort of new regional alignment, and which is also Pakistan's historical and traditional rivalries with India. For them, it was a worst case scenario if there is a pro-Israeli or pro-American government regime in Iran. This has the capability to endanger Pakistan's national security. So it's a win-win outcome, not only for Iran, but for Pakistan and for the region too. And I agree that the divide between Saudi Arabia and Iran has actually divided the whole region. And one of the aftermaths of this conflict or war, once peace deal is signed, that Pakistan is anxious, so are other countries, to see the reapproachment, the process of reapproachment between Saudi Arabia, which was initiated by Mohammed bin Salman, and which was due to number of reasons, the process was stalled. And Pakistan's other advantage in Middle East is Turkey. They have a very close relationship with Turkey. So these three countries, and they have also addressed the credibility issue, the trust deficit issue between Iran and USA. Iran was looking for some kind of guarantee, and I think through Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan, they have managed behind the scene to give that guarantee to Iran.
Thank you, Professor Malik. Now, let me bring back Ms. Zahra Ladha. Ms. Zahra Ladha, meanwhile, we can see the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz sending shockwaves through global energy markets and disproportionately impacting Europe and developing nations for that matter. So, by demonstrating its ability to choke off the global economy, has Iran permanently altered the balance of power, proving that asymmetrical leverage can neutralize conventional Western military superiority? How would you read this?
I think that reading is true to an extent. I think what Iran has done during this war is demonstrate that the cost of isolating and coercing Iran is higher than the cost of negotiating with it. So it's not really a question of neutralizing Western military power or US military power, which remains superior, but actually demonstrating the fact that Iran derives leverage from its geographical location its ability to affect energy markets, and its position within the regional security architecture. And I think the attacks on the Gulf states as well actually speak to this point. It's not that Iran is traditionally stronger than the US or Israel from a military perspective, but it has the ability to erase significant costs for the region, and that has shaped how it's able to play its position in these negotiations.
Mhm. And do you think that there could be any balancing act or balancing perhaps move from the United States to turn this point against Iran, perhaps?
I mean, in this situation, it's worth understanding what the costs and the benefits are for the US. And for the US, closing out this issue, demonstrating a win for domestic audiences, restoring international oil markets are the priority. And I think the faster both the US and Iran move away from an ideological position on this, or kind of making broad statements about power in general, the faster this is resolved. So if both states can to own interests and find a middle ground through these negotiations, we'll get to the end of this a lot faster.
Well, let's hope so. But meanwhile, let me bring Dr. Khaled Al-Kassimi. Dr. Khaled Al-Kassimi, earlier you were talking about, the double standards and the freedom of navigation, especially when the West invoke this when demanding the reopening of Hormuz, yet they simultaneously enforce crippling economic blockades and sanctions on Iranian ports. Now, how do you deconstruct this double standard, especially when it comes to Western economic warfare against Iran, and they deem it something quite lawful, but then when Iran, for example, has counter measures to defend itself, I mean, if we come to look at the very beginning of this aggression, it was the United States and Israel that actually attacked, so technically they are defending themselves, but they are labeled terrorists.
Yes. So, well, first of all, the asymmetry is real. The double standard is real. Okay. As Dr. Khodr and Mrs. Zahra have mentioned earlier, in war, each member wants to make sure they have leverage. But again, we need to highlight that there are members in the Iranian government, the moderates that I mentioned earlier, that have repeatedly argued that the IRGC's militarization of maritime policy weakens Iran's diplomatic position. And your guest the professor in Pakistan is absolutely right. We're trying to engage in diplomacy, but the battle of narratives that's happening in the media between the United States, the IRGC, and Israel, it's more ideological than politics. And I think our viewers need to be very careful in realizing that the president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, he's a moderate. He's not an IRGC member. He wants this war to end. People like Rouhani, Mohammad Jawad Zarif, they want this war to end. However, a 40-year grip on power in Iran has made the IRGC capable of, if you want, maneuvering a network of systems, whether it's politics, economics, security, the besiege. And I think it's indicative that yesterday we had a protest in Iran that was saying that Kalibab, pretty much the members that are negotiating in Pakistan, that they should resign their posts, because how dare you assume that the Iranians will negotiate a treaty with the United States. What I think is fascinating is that you have a protest in Iran, but that protest reinforces the hardliners, the IRGC's position. But when you have moderates that want to protest, saying, let's stop this war, let's negotiate, right? Let's stop militarizing freedom of navigation, because that's just going to give Israel and the United States, who are known to violate international humanitarian law in the region, you're going to give them more pretext to do what they've been doing for the past, since World War II, right? So we need to be we need to give moderates in Iran credit where it's due. And they've always favored economic integration in the international system. And they've always refused the IRGC militarizing the Strait of Hormuz as a strategic confrontation. And we've seen this, seizing tankers, whether in Bab el-Mandab with the Houthis, that doesn't necessarily reinforce a diplomatic deal. It actually exacerbates what people like Netanyahu want, which is let's continue this war because we can give him a lifeline to remain in power. This also gives the IRGC a lifeline because they know as soon as a deal is signed, there's going to be protests in Tehran. So quite ironically, you have the IRGC who knows that their days are numbered. Netanyahu knows his days are numbered. The longer we postpone signing this deal, right, the longer these individuals have a lifeline. So I will stop here because I think we need to give
actually,
room.
very nice point indeed when it comes to the dragon of this war, because this will affect many people and many parts of the world. And here, Dr. Khodr, Zaarour, this war has exposed the immense vulnerability of the US and global economies to Middle Eastern maritime disruptions. Now, will the US security establishment be forced to rethink its aggressive pro-Israel hardline posture, knowing that another miscalculation could trigger an unprecedented global recession? Not to mention that if this war goes longer, of course, we will have to reap very severe consequences.
Well, the globalization, as you know, is based on confidence in the international system, which is based on interdependence. Well, when you interrupt the flow of 20% of the global markets in the Middle East or the Arabian Gulf, that will shake the confidence of the system. Again, when you have a war, it could be a mini war, it could be a regional war, the economic markets, the international markets will feel it. The taxpayers will feel it. Buyers and sellers will feel it. So this ripple effect is bound to happen. Some countries are able to withstand interruptions of shipping, others cannot. Iran, we have seen. I mean, Pakistan, the reason why Pakistan is really active in this diplomatic cycles we have seen last few months is because Pakistan has a lot to lose, the most to lose with international interruptions in the Gulf. So a lot of countries in the Gulf have a lot to lose. Global markets will be disrupted, especially the Chinese market. China is really worried and pushing behind the scenes for settlement. In fact, President Trump went to Beijing, and the topic was, how do we end this war? A week later, we have seen President Putin going to also to Beijing, talking about the same thing. They need this war to end. But when you have a regional player with a lot of groups supporting this regime, whether it's Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, other places, and the United States with its allies, we have kind of a stalemate. And this stalemate only harms people, doesn't help people. So eventually, American investors will push Congress, will push the White House to find a peaceful resolution so they could, rake in more profits. As long as the war drags on, we're going to see less profit in their bank accounts. So I think the business industry, the business community in New York and other places in the US will push the White House to make a deal not only possible, but permanent.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Now, Professor Tahir, Naeem, Malik, developing nations bore the brunt of the spiking oil prices caused by this war. So does this economic fallout accelerate the push by non-Western nations to decouple from the petrodollar and establish alternative, like sanction-proof energy supply chains outside of US control?
Yes, I think, and in BRICS and a number of other forums, SCO, this is being taken very seriously. But I think Pakistan, for the last couple of years, we have bought oil from Russia too. And we have, is a lot of collaboration between them. And we see these, once sanctions are lifted against Iran in some a decade ago, we signed a Pakistan-Iran gas pipeline, and Iran has done its part. But due to the sanctions, Pakistan was not interested. So it is energy corridor for Pakistan, not only Iran, but Central Asia. And secondly, with Iran, unofficially, we are buying petroleum products. But once sanction is lifted, then we have opportunity to buy oil directly from Iran. So this is one thing. It is not only just Pakistan. Pakistan's economy is under stress. But after 1973 oil crisis, when King Faisal was there, and during the Arab-Israel war, oil was used as a weapon. For the first time, we have seen the oil prices soar. And now we have seen this, that the security, the military strategic miscalculation on the part of USA that this war will remain confined between Iran and USA. It will be a limited war and there will be a regime change. So, but Iran has cleverly done this. It has created impact through this war on global energy market and supply chains. And the second aspect is the vulnerability of security regime of Gulf countries is also badly exposed. If we look at UAE, look at Qatar, the USA was not there to protect them. So the vulnerability of those states is also a big question mark. And I agree with the rest of the panelists, except for the fact that we, in our discussion, forget that Iran was attacked, and we keep on blaming Iran. They have many faults, but this time the USA is unsuccessful. This regime change operation, which went successfully in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, but this regime change operation was not successful Iran. It's time for the US policymakers to think. And they keep on shifting the goalposts, the objectives of the war. First, they said we are interested in regime change, and we went there for regime change. Secondly, they said that we have obliterated the nuclear weapons. And thirdly, they said that we are going to describe the civilization. The stature of US foreign policy has declined. We have seen we are entering into a phase where rules-based international system, international law doesn't exist. And there is a populist challenge. They declare the war, they declare the victory, they declare the peace. In one day, there are more than a dozen tweets and some inconsistent talks. So I think for US military overstretch and their summit, one thing is clear, that once this war stops, America will think twice of attacking Iran on behalf of Israel due to this experience of war.
Amazing. Now, let me get back to you, Ms. Zahra Ladha. Europe, meanwhile, has been largely sidelined during this war, forced to swallow the severe economic consequences of a conflict it did not even want. Now, is the European political elite beginning to realize that unquestioning subservience to US foreign policy is actively undermining the continent's own security and economic sovereignty? And what could be the solution to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think here I differentiate between this war we're seeing in Iran and actually the war that came 20 or so years before it with Iraq. We've really seen European states just stay out of this despite the US president's best efforts. And what we're really seeing here is not subservience to the US order, but an inability to shape it. And I think the question going forward for Europe, and this has been already said in several European capitals, is how Europe can now advance its own strategic objectives and its own security objectives in the region and beyond, and whether this is a focus on securing energy supplies, diversifying those, or really a push to kind of stabilize the security environment in the region, whether that's in Lebanon, and we've seen some efforts there from France, or in Iraq, or of course in this kind of greater engagement with Iran and the US that remains to be seen. But what we're really seeing here is an inability to act rather than a question of subservience. So the question of Europe's strategic autonomy is very much on the table right now in European capitals.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Khaled Al-Kassimi, if we come to look at the situation of the United States, which is actually stuck in yet another war in the Middle East, China, meanwhile, has been watching closely, expanding its diplomatic and economic footprint without actually firing a single shot. How has the US escalation against Iran inadvertently accelerated the transition toward a multipolar world order led by Beijing and Moscow, the very thing that the United States was trying to avoid?
Well, before I answer this question, I think from a geopolitical perspective, before the war started on February 28th, 2026, the United States shifted and had one of the biggest maritime shifts where their Air Force fleets shifted from the South China Sea to the Gulf. So this conflict that began in February resulted in the biggest maritime Air Force shift since the year 2001 from 9/11. So while all eyes are on Iran, all eyes should actually be on China. China's Belt and Road Initiative that has been going on for over a decade now. And there's a lot of nodes and geopolitical choke points, whether in Africa or in the Arab region, that are directly part of this economic supply chain. And as we all know, from a geographic perspective, without Iran, there is no Belt and Road Initiative project because Iran is literally the land bridge for China connecting the East and West, right? So I think once we consider that and we come out of like the narratives of like what Iran is saying, what Trump is saying, etc., we end up realizing that this war is, as your guest said earlier, it is really China. That's the target here. And so what I would say, to go back to specifically the question, the war has accelerated multipolarity, but not in the sense of like America declines, China rises. It's not Manichaean in that sense, we're black and white. The reality is much more structural. Hence, President Donald Trump visiting President Xi Jinping a few weeks ago. So this war has directly targeted China's economic lifeline. Okay. So GCC, as your guest, Dr. Khodr, has said, but also, if you want, paralyzing Iran as a land bridge for China's economic aspirations and projects in Africa and the Arab world and across the world. So that's why China didn't really respond in military force, but with strategic repositioning. So it has expanded its overland energy corridors through Central Asia. It's increased its reliance on Russian oil, and it's accelerated investments in the Pakistan corridor and the Indian Ocean rim. So the port of Gwadar, which has been on the books for over like 15 years, it seems, and obviously your guest from Pakistan is probably more competent to answer this than me. But the Gwadar port is a very important port for China for the Belt and Road Initiative. And what happened in Iran, let's call a spade a spade. China doesn't really care who rules Iran. Russia doesn't really care who rules Iran. They need a stable Iran. right? So, but I just have one more thing to say, if possible, to just, if I may, do I have time?
Quickly, please.
I think Arabs have come out of this in some sort of way. They've recatalyzed their economic potential. So they're not waiting for the United States to open the Strait of Hormuz or Iran to dismantle the mines in the ocean. They've recalibrated their economic corridors, whether the Hejaz, a railway with the MOU signed with Turkey. Abu Dhabi has developed the Fujairah pipeline, which is a new pipeline between Abu Dhabi and ADNOC. So I think we need to also appreciate the fact that the Arab world is not simply waiting for the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, it's a very important strait for choke point for the international economic intercourse. However, there are alternatives. So every war has opportunities, and I think Arabs have come out of this in a sense where they've diversified their portfolios, just like Pakistan has.
The fact that they have alternatives, the alternatives can be costly, and perhaps it will take a long time before they start actually functioning. And here, thank you, Dr. Al-Kassimi. Let me bring Dr. Khodr Zaarour. The pivot to Asia, Dr. Khodr, was actually supposed to be Washington's defining strategy to counter China. Instead, the US was dragged back into a Middle Eastern war. So how much has this war compromised America's ability to contain its superpower rivals? And is the US establishment finally acknowledging this is a catastrophic strategic distraction?
Well, I think the United States left a lot of unfinished work in the Middle East, going from, into Afghanistan, out of Afghanistan, into Iraq, out of Iraq, have seen the Oslo peace process dying before their eyes, even with their help and support, or ignoring the process in the first place, or undermining the process. The United States cannot disentangle from the Middle East without finishing the work, without following a strategy. There is no strategy in Washington. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is no strategy. There are policies. Every president has a view. Every president has his own philosophy and his own vision. But there is no overall strategy. Like after the Second World War, there was a clear strategy. There is no such thing now. And what gave kind of China, if I could use an ancient Chinese proverb, they say, speak softly but carry big stick. That's what exactly China is doing. They are showing their military muscle. They are showing their economic muscle by investing in all over the world, from the Caribbean to the Arabian Sea, throughout Africa. So the United States has miscalculated by using their overconfidence and their military capabilities. The United States, no question, has the military might to do whatever it wants, but it cannot clean up the mess after the destruction of the war. We have seen Iraq in much worse off than it was before Saddam was deposed. We have seen Afghanistan going back to square one. We have seen Sudan fragmenting. We have seen Yemen fragmenting. We have seen Lebanon becoming kind of obsolete in the Middle East, a dying state. So I think the pivot to China, the pivot to Asia, came a little too late. That pivot should have came in the early 90s when the only superpower in the world was the US. Washington dominated international politics until around 2015, 2016, maybe 2017. That 30-year period gave China a lot of time to find itself, to invest and rebuild itself. Just one fact, in 2018, China poured more cement in China in 1 year than the US did in 100 years. That's development. We have not seen that much development in the US, much less in US friendly nations. So I think China took advantage of the US absence, or dragged into an endless war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and for the protection of Israel. And Israel has an expansionist policy, so does Iran. Both have expansionist policies that we cannot ignore or overlook. And the U.S. was sandwiched between two ideologies that are confronting each other. So even if we find a peace negotiation, a peace treaty now between Iran and the U.S., it will be short-lived, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned Lebanon, I would like to ask this question to Ms. Zahra Ladha concerning Lebanon. Technically, if Lebanon is out of the equation in this peace talks, when we have the U.S. claiming that there is a comprehensive deal with Tehran and it is near, can any agreement truly hold if the Lebanese front remains ablaze?
Yeah, and it's a good question because Lebanon is very central to how things move forward now. Iran is very, very unlikely to agree to a deal in which Israel maintains complete operational freedom in Lebanon. And this is for two reasons. It's worth mentioning here again, as I'm sure the audience is aware, that Hezbollah joined this war in support of Iran. So just the optics of leaving an ally behind like that sends a very significant message to the remainder of the axis of resistance, as Tehran refers to it, which Iran still requires. I mean, Iran has multiple levers of deterrence. We've seen what they've done in the Strait of Hormuz. We've seen them open up different arenas of conflict in the region. But to leave behind an ally that's intervened on your behalf kind of unravels the whole point of the axis of resistance, which is that, you know, there's a unification of arenas, as they say, in this doctrine. The second point is that the framework that we're seeing negotiated between the US and Iran right now isn't just a framework for peace between the two countries. It's actually a framework for how the region looks. Iran has, for better or worse, redrawn the security architecture in the region. A lot of things are in flux. And what Tehran doesn't want to see is Israel dictate the terms of the new security architecture in the Levant. And leaving Lebanon behind, or leaving Hezbollah behind, to be more precise, does allow Tel Aviv to do that. So the real question now is not whether Iran will leave them behind, but whether America, Iran, and Israel can find some common ground in this negotiation that allows things to move forward. But because both for optical reasons and actually security reasons, Iran is highly unlikely to leave its key allies, one of its biggest allies in the region, to face Tel Aviv alone, especially when questions about disarmament are prevalent in the questions about Iraqi militias, whether they'll integrate into the state, whether or not they'll disarm. All levers that Tehran uses to maintain its strategic advantage. And it's, again, it wouldn't make sense for Tehran at this point to lose that strategic advantage.
Thank you so much, Ms. Zahra Ladha. Now, as a final question, as we run out of time, to Professor Tahir Naeem Malik, with Pakistan mediating the ceasefire and China serving as Iran's primary economic partner, are we witnessing the foundation of a new Asian-led security architecture in the Gulf, one that explicitly marginalizes the United States and prioritizes regional stability over zero-sum hegemony?
I think we can now, with the disintegration of Soviet Union, and there are two trends. One is the resurgence of Russia, and there is a limited role of Russia in Middle East through Turkey and other states, and it has some of the economic and trade related engagement. But with China is more interested towards geoeconomics. The geo-economic dimension of China through Belt and Road Initiative it signifies geoeconomics. But behind the scene, I think militarily and defense-related components of China are fully active behind Iran, Pakistan. We have seen this in war between Pakistan and India. So China is introvert historically, and it would not like to engage militarily in Middle East, but through its diplomatic, economic good offices and the volume of trade between Middle East and China, behind the scene, we also see defense cooperation. So one thing is for sure that this is the first war in post-Cold War where the NATO allies, the European allies, are not with the United States. And this is a new dimension. So things are in a flux, and we see a multipolarity. And I agree that there is no decline of US power, but there is competition and turbulence.
Thank you so much. And this brings us to the end of our special coverage on the war in Iran. My gratitude and thanks go to all my panel of experts, Ms. Zahra Ladha, Dr. Khaled Al-Kassimi, Dr. Khodr Zaarour, Professor Tahir, Naeem, Malik. Thank you all for your invaluable insights. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News Channel. Until next time, have a good one.